In Module 3, we are going to discuss principles of ISO 9000, which provide a the basis for the actual standard. So the ISO 9000 QMS principles were documented in the version that was updated in 2000, and these principles are supposed to be used by senior management as a guiding principle towards improved performance. The first principle is customer focus. Second principle is leadership. The third one is the involvement of people. The fourth one is a process approach. The fifth one is a systems approach to management. The sixth is continual improvement. The seventh is factual approach to decision making. And the eighth is mutually beneficial supplier relationships. So as you can see, the 8 principles basically covers the overall system that we would need to have in place for producing a product and to ensure that the quality of the product that is produced is in fact what we claim that it ought to be. The first principle is customer focus. And in the early versions of the ISO 9000 standard, if I remember right, one of the things that was missing was this whole idea of customer focus. And one of the criticisms of the ISO standard was that you could be producing what you claim you do and in the way that you do, but if what you produced was really not what the customer wanted, then you could not really call that a quality product. And therefore, when the principles and the document from the year 2000 and then later on the clauses in the year 2008 were published, the customer focus became a very integral part of the ISO standard. Quite obviously, all organizations need customers, and therefore if we are to survive and to thrive in the future, we need to understand what the customer needs not only today but also potentially in the future, and we need to learn how to not only meet but exceed customer expectations. This is something which we've been talking about throughout this particular course. Quite obviously, if you are able to do this, you will have a better market share and you will be able to exploit any market opportunities that exist. If you have a better customer focus, quite obviously all your resources are going to be better utilized to help meet the customer requirements, and as you do a better job of meeting customer requirements, you will tend to develop a more loyal base of customers and will have more repeat business. And quite obviously, companies are all trying to focus on getting repeat business because it's much easier to get repeat business than to try and get a new customer. Basically, if you apply the first principle correctly, then quite obviously it requires you to research and understand what the customer requires and ensure that the organization's purpose is linked to what the customer wants. That means if the customer wants something that is low cost and you are focusing on a high-end product, quite obviously those two will not be in sync with each other. The third thing is you will need to communicate the customer needs and expectations throughout the organization, and things such as QFD, things such as the quality by design, these are all techniques which can be used to communicate the customer needs throughout the organization. You then need to measure customer satisfaction by whatever means. There are all kinds of means which we have also discussed, and once you get the an indication of how satisfied the customer is, if there are any gaps in the customer satisfaction, then you need to act on those results. You need to manage customer relationships, and you need to ensure a balanced approach because ultimately you are a business. So you need to find ways in which the customer can be satisfied as well as the employees, suppliers, etc., all the other stakeholders, including the local community and society as a whole, are all satisfied. Principle 2, which is leadership. Quite obviously, leadership has started to play a very big role from the standpoint of the impact that it has on the organization's ability to do something. And because leaders basically provide the purpose and the direction to the organization, and therefore once they provide this kind of a strong purpose and direction, people can become more fully involved in helping achieve the organization's objectives because they are clear in terms of what is expected of them. So quite obviously the key benefits of this principle is that people understand exactly where the organization is headed and would be motivated to do their best. Their activities would get evaluated and in a particular unified, in a standardized way, and there will be hopefully less miscommunication among the various levels of the organization because it is the leadership's responsibility to ensure that everybody in the organization has clarity with regard to what is expected of them. Applying this principle typically requires that we consider the needs of all the parties, including customers, employees, suppliers, etc. And we need to state a clear vision and mission of the organization. Now, we've talked about the vision and the mission statement, and the unfortunate part, as I've been mentioning to you, is that if all this gets restricted to is a vision and mission statement, then we are really shortchanging ourselves. This ought to be the actual vision and mission by which we live and by which we actually manage and run the company. We then need to set specific goals and targets, and these ought to be challenging so that it not only does the organization move ahead, but also people like challenging goals and targets because it gives them a way to develop their own personal abilities. You need to create and sustain shared values, fairness, and ethical practices and role models at all levels. Or the fact is that when you talk about values, you need to have clearly stated values which ought to be practiced at all levels in the organization. It is not that we say something and we do something totally different. We need to be fair to all the people, and we need to make sure that we behave in ethical manner. We need to establish trust. We've talked about eliminating fear. That is something which Deming talked about very, very clearly. People who are required to perform certain tasks need certain resources, and therefore it is a responsibility of leadership to provide those resources, to provide the training, and to hold those people accountable for the tasks that they are assigned. It is the leadership's role to inspire and to encourage and to recognize people's contributions as well. The third principle, which is the involvement of people, quite obviously the involvement is something which has come a little bit late in terms of the organization's understanding that, because earlier the involvement was restricted to the people in management, but slowly I think organizations are starting to understand that people at all levels need to or bring not only their hands and feet but also their skills, their brains, and they ought to be fully involved in their jobs. And obviously the benefits are that you get more motivation when you have people more completely involved in their task, and from this motivation you are going to get more commitment and creativity and in this way you are going to be able to achieve the organization's objectives much better. People will be more accountable, and in a sense, you, as I think we have discussed earlier, people would be eager to participate in various activities and contribute to the well-being of the organization. We have talked about this in the theory X and theory Y. That depends on how you view it. If you view people as someone or a person as someone who really is keen to work, is keen to give off his best, then quite obviously you need to create an environment in which that person gets an opportunity to do so. Applying this particular principle typically requires that you need to understand, or the people need to understand, how what they are doing is important to the organization. So for example, if you have somebody who is working on an assembly line and all he is doing is tightening one particular bolt day in, day out, does that person really understand what would happen if he were to not do his task absolutely perfectly? What is the impact that it would have on the customer, and what is the impact of that on the organization? Because if the customer is not satisfied, quite obviously the organization's business is going to suffer. So people at all levels, whether it is somebody who is the security guard, whether it is somebody who is the CFO, whether it is somebody who is a design engineer, everybody needs to understand in what way they are actually contributing to the organization. They also need to identify what are the constraints to the performance, and as a result they basically have to accept ownership for the basic jobs that they are doing, and by accepting ownership, they accept ownership not only of the problems, but they need to assume the responsibility for solving them. People evaluate the performance against their own personal goals and objectives. When you have people fully understanding what is expected of them, they are in a position to actually set forth personal goals and objectives which they can evaluate on their own. People would be looking for opportunities to enhance their own abilities, to develop their competence, their knowledge, their experience via training, via more broader responsibilities, and so on. And as a result, you find that people would be more freely sharing knowledge and the experience which has created the knowledge, and also discussing problems and issues so that you don't have others reinventing the wheel all the time. The fourth principle is the process approach, and the process approach, as we have discussed earlier, is obviously the most useful approach in looking at how the system behaves. The benefits of a process approach are obviously lower costs and shorter cycle times, because here we are really looking at how the resources are utilized to achieve the ends that are required, and you tend to get more predictable results, and you get also you can look at improvement opportunities in a more focused fashion. Applying the process approach requires that we systematically define what are the activities required to obtain a desired result. This obviously goes beyond the typical silo organization that we see in most companies, where you have the finance, the engineering, manufacturing, etc. But we need to identify, if a particular process is to be accomplished, what are the various activities, and therefore where does the responsibility and the accountability lie for the key activities. We need to be able to analyze and measure the capability of these key activities, as well as identify the interfaces both within the functions and between the functions of the organizations. The biggest problem that lies when you have a process that actually cuts across various functional boundaries is that you have a lot of miscommunication or lack of communication at the interfaces, and as a result you have mistakes or you have delays in the activity being completed, and therefore these interfaces need to be clearly identified and managed. You need to focus on resources, the methods, etc., that will help improve the key activities in the organization, and also you need to evaluate the risks and the consequences of the activities on the customers, suppliers, and other parties. The fifth principle is the system approach to management. Basically, as we have talked about several times in the course, when we talk about a systems approach, we really need to look at the system as a whole and not try to sub-optimize looking at the objectives of a very narrow part of the organization. So you need to understand the interrelated processes and how these contribute to the overall objectives, the overall goals of the organization. And by doing so, what you get is a better alignment of all the activities, all the processes, and you are better able to achieve the basic desired results of the organization. Otherwise, what you will get is one area starts to look good, another area starts to look good, but overall the company does not seem to be benefiting or progressing because we have really failed to recognize the systems concept in behind all of this. You need to provide using a systems approach allows us to focus on processes that are key to the success of the organization, and therefore people who are associated with this have a greater confidence in terms of the consistency, effectiveness, and the efficiency of the organization. Now, in order to apply the systems approach, what we really need to do is you need to structure the system in such a way that, or the objectives of the system, so that we are able, I think I misstated that. The system ought to be structured in such a way that we are able to achieve the organization's objectives in the best way possible. We need to be very clear about the interdependencies between the various functional areas, between the processes, and make sure that we do not focus on sub-optimization. We need to provide a better understanding of the roles and responsibilities of various individuals and of various functions, focusing primarily on the common objectives of the organization, and we need to reduce to the extent possible the barriers that exist between functional departments that are there in organizations. We need to understand what are the resource constraints, what are the capabilities, and we need to define how specific activities within the organization should operate, and we need to have a system in place for continual improvement, measurement, and evaluation. Principle 6 talks about continual improvement, and I think we know very well that when we have a system that is continually improving, we have performance that will keep on improving over a period of time, and it allows us to do what we have been doing better, and that means basically also meeting customer requirements. So when we talk about applying the principle of continual improvement, it requires us to have a consistent organization-wide approach to continual improvement, and in order to do so, we need to provide people with the training as well as the tools of continual improvement. They need to understand what is continual improvement and how they are expected to achieve it. The continual improvement has to become part of the objective of each and every individual in the organizations, and this can be related to either the products, the processes, or the systems that the person may be involved in. And you need to have a method to measure the results of this continual improvement, so that we are able to assess how well we are doing. And finally, we need to have a way of recognizing and acknowledging improvements after they have occurred. Principle 7 talks about factual approach to decision making. That means you do not base it on gut feel and whims and fancies of somebody simply because that person is in a more powerful position in the organization. The benefits of this, quite obviously, is that the decisions will be based on actual data, and therefore you are able to prove or demonstrate the reasoning behind what you did, and therefore it's easier to review and challenge previous decisions that may have been based on opinions. And when data is actually used, it is very difficult to argue with data. Using this particular principle requires that data and information are sufficiently accurate and reliable, and this can be an issue for organizations, because a lot of times organizations are not in the habit of keeping data. Number two, when they are in the habit of keeping data, we are really not sure how accurate this data is. And I have seen this in a number of cases, especially when we've gone out and done some consulting in the area of warehousing, logistics, etc. Now, secondly, once you have data that is of good quality, you need to make sure that's available to those who require it, and they have the tools and techniques for actually analyzing and using this particular data. And also, there ought to be a formalized way of making decisions based on this particular analysis, which can and should perhaps be balanced with experience and intuition. That means that data alone cannot give us all the information that we need. It will give us part of the information, but beyond a certain point, it is also using that data with the person's judgment to say, okay, so now how do we interpret the results of this particular analysis, and what would it mean in terms of whether it is future market direction, whether it is growth, etc., or technology, whatever it might be. That needs to be balanced with experience of the individuals. The 8th principle is mutually beneficial supplier relationships. And again, as we have been talking, suppliers are a very integral part of an organization, and therefore we depend to a very great extent on the suppliers. More and more organizations are purchasing a larger part of their the items that go into the end product by value, and therefore it is it makes sense that we do ensure that we have a mutually beneficial relationship with our suppliers, so that we help the suppliers, and by helping the suppliers we help ourselves, because the suppliers then can provide better product and at on a more regular or predictable schedule. The key benefits of this is, quite obviously, you can create value for both parties. The supplier can benefit from getting more information, because if the customer, for example, Maruti has some excellent systems in place for helping their suppliers. Toyota, of course, is well known for its ability to and its systems for working with suppliers. But essentially, when an OEM or a customer works to help the suppliers, the supplier who may be smaller a lot of times can learn a lot from the experience and the knowledge of the customer, and therefore is able to improve its own processes. And by doing so, the customer also benefits, because the product quality improves as well as the delivery. The flexibility and the speed of joint responses to changing market conditions, quite obviously, are the kind of market that we are living in or we are experiencing. sees a lot of changes, and if you are going to need a lot of very fast response from your supplier, it becomes necessary to have the supplier capable of responding in a quick manner. And therefore, when you have better communication and you have better understanding and better ability on the part of both, quite obviously any change in the market conditions can be reacted to much more efficiently on the part of the supplier, and as a result your costs and your resources are better utilized. In order to apply this particular relationship, you need to have a basic relationship that will balance the short-term gains with long-term consideration. In fact, more and more companies are looking to establish a long-term partnership, at least with their key suppliers, because it does not behoove them and it does not give them any advantage to be constantly changing those key suppliers for a slight reduction in the perceived cost of that particular product or service, because ultimately in the long run what people have found is that quality and service is likely to suffer. You would need to pool expertise and resources with your partners, whether it be a supplier or a customer. You need to identify and select key suppliers and have clear and open communication. You need to share information. These are really keys, and you need to ensure that the suppliers and or the customers are clear about your future plans, because they can then invest appropriately. And when you are coming up with a new product, establishing a joint development and improvement activities actually helps in utilizing the expertise of both wherever that expertise lies, and in being able to provide a solution that is more appropriate. And you need to inspire, encourage and recognize improvements from the supplier, just as you would in your own organization.